For 2 years, Alexander Drake had barely spoken to the woman he married. In his mind, she was nothing more than a graceful figure placed perfectly in his penthouse for the occasional charity, photograph, or magazine spread. Evelyn Carter had the kind of elegance and beauty that photographed flawlessly among high society, but beyond that she was invisible to him. It wasn't love, not even companionship. It was an arrangement, and that night everything began to change when Alexander returned. Well past midnight from a business trip that ended with a grueling flight and an even more exhausting board meeting. The penthouse was silent. The kind of silence he usually found comforting until he poured himself a glass of whiskey, intending to retreat to his private study. When he caught the faint sound of running water down the hallway, the bathroom door was slightly ajar, and steam curled out into the corridor like soft, ghostly fingers. Without thinking, he stepped closer, the quiet hum of the water pulling him in until through the narrow opening he saw her sitting on the marble floor of the shower, with her knees drawn tightly to her chest and her head bowed low. The water poured over her in a relentless curtain, soaking her hair until it clung to her bare shoulders, while tears slid down her face. Indistinguishable from the droplets on her skin, yet the way her lips trembled and her body shook with silent sobs told him exactly what they were. Alexander froze with a strange tightness gripping his chest, because in all the public events where she had smiled flawlessly, and in all the dinners where she had been perfectly poised, he had never seen her like this, stripped of her designer gowns and polished makeup. Raw and human in a way that unsettled him, he told himself to walk away, to close the door quietly and leave her to her privacy, because this wasn't part of their arrangement. But he stayed with his hand resting on the edge of the door, and his pulse loud in his ears until Evelyn lifted her head slightly, as if sensing him there, her eyes meeting his through the haze of steam. For a heartbeat, neither moved, and in that fragile moment, Alexander realized something he had never allowed himself to consider. She wasn't a decoration. She was a woman who could break, who could feel, who could cry when no one was supposed to be watching, and the image of her vulnerable and bare would follow him long after the water stopped running. He never spoke of what he saw that night, though the sight of Evelyn in the shower lingered in his mind like a haunting melody, but he buried it beneath the endless demands of work, and still, in the days that followed, he found himself glancing at her more often while she moved around the penthouse, quietly like a ghost, with perfect posture, always composed, and always distant. Because 2 years of marriage had trained her to hide every emotion behind an immaculate mask. It had started with a handshake instead of a kiss on their wedding day, and had never progressed beyond polite small talk or the occasional posed photograph. The marriage between Alexander and Evelyn was an arrangement agreed upon by their families for reasons that had nothing to do with love. The Drake Empire was on the verge of a massive expansion into Europe, but Alexander's father had insisted he project stability to the press and to investors because a bachelor CEO was unpredictable while a married one was dependable. Evelyn's once prestigious family had been drowning in debt after a failed real estate venture, and her parents had offered the marriage as a solution. The Drakes would pay off the debt, and in return, the Carters would provide a refined, educated daughter to stand beside Alexander. The contract was signed, the vows exchanged, and the walls between them built from the very first day. On a crisp Thursday morning, Alexander stood in the kitchen with a tablet in one hand and a black coffee in the other, scrolling through a list of upcoming events, when his eyes paused on one in particular: the annual Whitmore Gala, a gathering of New York's elite and international art patrons, just 3 nights away. It was an event that demanded appearances and invited speculation if certain people were absent. He had never taken Evelyn to any of these, and had never wanted her there. But something made him look up from the tablet and watch her at the dining table, where she was sketching something in a leather-bound notebook with her brow furrowed in concentration. He cleared his throat, and she glanced up with a cautious look in her eyes. "Do you have something suitable to wear to the Whitmore Gala?" His voice was flat, almost businesslike, but it made her pause mid-motion. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked. "A dress," he clarified, "appropriate to accompany me to the gala on Saturday." Evelyn blinked at him, the words sinking in. Slowly, because in 2 years she had never once appeared publicly on his arm. "Why are you asking me now?" she said, her voice tinged with suspicion. "Because I need you there. It's important." He replied without looking away. She studied him for a long moment, as if searching for the catch. "And if I don't want to go?" His gaze hardened slightly. "It's not optional." She let out a small, incredulous laugh. "Of course." Like everything else in this marriage, he ignored the sting in her tone, but something flickered in his chest. "This event brings together some of our most influential partners. I want you to be presentable." Her chin lifted. "Presentable," she repeated softly, as though tasting the word. "You don't even know who I am, Alexander. You've never bothered to find out." His silence was an answer in itself. She leaned back in her chair. "Tell me my favorite color. Tell me what I studied. Tell me what I do when I'm not sitting in this penthouse, playing the role you cast me in." His jaw tightened, but no words came. She gave a short, humorless smile. "That's what I thought." Closing her notebook, she stood. "I'll go to your gala, Mr. Drake, not because it's a duty, but because I'm curious to see the world you chose over me." As she walked past him, he felt a strange pull and an unwillingness to let her go without saying something, but the words never formed, and that night alone in his study, Alexander stared at a blank document on his laptop. His mind should have been on the final numbers for a property acquisition in Milan, but all he could see was the way Evelyn's eyes had glinted with defiance. For the first time in 2 years, he realized he did not have complete control over her, and for reasons he could not explain, the thought unsettled him far more than it should have. The night of the Whitmore Gala arrived with a chill in the air, and a restless hum in Alexander's chest that he could not quite shake. He had not seen Evelyn since breakfast, and when she finally appeared at the top of the staircase, every sound in the penthouse seemed to fade. She wore a deep emerald gown that moved like liquid silk. The kind of dress that drew the eye, not because it was loud, but because it whispered elegance in every fold. Her hair was swept into a soft twist, exposing the graceful line of her neck, and Alexander told himself he was only observing because he needed her to look the part yet. When she stepped toward him, something in his pulse shifted. "You look appropriate," he said with a voice carefully neutral. She offered a polite smile that did not reach her eyes, and in the car, the silence between them felt thick as she stared out the tinted window. With her reflection fractured by passing streetlights, Alexander wanted to ask her what she had been sketching that morning, but the words caught in his throat. At the gala, the air shimmered with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of strategic conversations, while crystal chandeliers cast warm light across gowns and tuxedos. As they entered, cameras flashed, and for the first time, Evelyn's hand rested lightly on his arm for the sake of appearances. He told himself it meant nothing until he saw her in conversation with an older European patron speaking flawless Italian, as she described an art installation. She was poised but animated, her eyes alive in a way he had never witnessed at home. The patron laughed, clearly charmed, and Alexander found himself lingering at the edge of the crowd, watching her as though seeing a stranger. When the man finally moved on, Alexander stepped closer. "I didn't know you spoke Italian," he said. "There's a lot you don't know," she replied evenly, taking a sip of champagne. Before he could respond, a new voice joined them. "Evelyn Carter, I presume." Adrian Cross was younger than Alexander. A rising star in international investment circles, known for his charisma and relentless pursuit of opportunities, he extended a hand and Evelyn accepted it with a gracious smile. "I've heard about your work in adaptive design," Adrian said. "Your portfolio from the Carter Foundation renovations was impressive." Alexander's brows drew together. He had not known she had done such work. "You've seen my portfolio?" Evelyn asked. "I make it my business to notice talent," Adrian replied. "In fact, I'm working on a luxury project in Milan, and could use someone with your vision." Alexander felt something tighten in his chest. Evelyn's commitments are here, he said, before she could answer. She glanced at him briefly, then back to Adrian. "I'd be interested to hear more," she said. "Perhaps we can meet to discuss it." Adrian smiled. "Perfect. I'll have my assistant reach out." As the evening wore on, Alexander found himself staying closer to her than he intended. Intercepting conversations before Adrian could reappear, it wasn't strategy. It was instinct. In the car ride home from the gala, Evelyn finally broke the silence, saying that the evening had been exhausting, and Alexander told her she had handled it well. Even with Adrian Cross circling like a hawk, her lips curved faintly. And she asked if that was jealousy she heard. He looked out the window and replied that it was awareness. Awareness of the fact that some men didn't see her as decoration. The words hung between them heavier than he expected, and back at the penthouse, she disappeared into her room. Without another word, leaving him alone in the dim light of the living room with his tie loose and his mind restless. For the first time in 2 years, he wondered if he had made a mistake by never knowing the woman who bore his name. The following week passed with a strange tension in the air. The kind that clung to quiet hallways and lingered in glances that lasted a fraction too long. Alexander told himself it was the usual fatigue after a major event, yet he noticed small changes in his own behavior. He paused at the breakfast table instead of leaving immediately, and he found excuses to ask Evelyn if she needed anything before he headed to the office. She answered politely, with the same distance she had always kept, but there was a subtle edge in her eyes now, as if she knew something had shifted. On Wednesday afternoon, Alexander returned home earlier than usual with an unfamiliar impulse pulling him away from the office, and as the elevator doors opened onto the penthouse, he heard voices from the living room. Stepping in quietly, he saw Evelyn seated across from Adrian with a leather portfolio open between them, displaying architectural sketches and interior concepts. She leaned forward, pointing at a drawing as her face lit with energy while explaining how the natural light in Milan would completely change the way people experienced the space. Adrian nodded with interest, telling her that she was the perfect person for the job, because she understood both structure and feeling. Alexander stepped forward with a voice calm but edged, saying he hadn't realized they were entertaining guests. Evelyn looked up without flinching, and explained that Adrian had stopped by to discuss the Milan project. Alexander asked if she was considering it, and she replied yes, because it was an opportunity to do something meaningful with her skills. Adrian glanced between them and offered to leave, but Alexander told him to stay because he wanted to understand why his wife was making career decisions without talking to him. Evelyn's gaze sharpened, and she said it was because for 2 years, he had shown no interest in who she was beyond being presentable, and that this was the first time in years someone had looked at her and seen more than a last name on an invitation. Alexander's jaw tightened, and he said she was his wife. She replied that on paper she was free to use her talents as she wished. Adrian shifted uncomfortably before excusing himself, and once the door closed, Alexander stepped closer, asking if she really thought Adrian was offering the job out of pure professional admiration. She said yes, and if there was more, she could handle it. He told her she was naive if she believed that, and she shot back that he was arrogant to think he could decide what was worth her time. They stood in tense silence until Alexander admitted he didn't like the way Adrian looked at her. She asked in what way, and he said like he wanted something that belonged to him. She laughed without humor, saying she was not property, and not a suit or a penthouse view he could own. His gaze didn't waver, as he said she was his wife, and that meant something to him. She replied that it meant nothing if it was only about control, and then she picked up her portfolio, saying that if he wanted to keep pretending the marriage was about appearances, fine, but she would not stop living her life, simply because he had suddenly decided to pay attention. She walked out, leaving him standing there with her defiance burning in his mind, and for the first time in years, the feeling consuming him was raw jealousy. He could not disguise as irritation or business strategy. That night, Alexander could not sleep. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word of their argument, and the way Evelyn's voice had sharpened when she said she would not stop living her life. The way she had stood her ground without raising her tone haunted him in a way he had not expected, because he was not used to people challenging him. Most backed down the moment his voice dropped or his gaze hardened, but she had not. She had looked right through him as if searching for something he didn't even know was there. In the early hours of the morning, he rose and walked through the quiet penthouse ending up outside her closed bedroom door. He stood there listening to the faint sound of her breathing before turning away without knocking. The next day he buried himself in work, but the unease followed him like a shadow until late in the afternoon, when he passed by his father's office at Drake International and overheard a conversation he wasn't meant to hear. His father's voice was low but firm as he said the Carter arrangement was the smartest move Alexander had made because their debts had been a liability. And now they were out of the way, and his image was clean. The European investors trusted a married man more than they would ever trust a bachelor. Alexander froze in the hallway. He had always known the marriage was a transaction, but hearing it spoken about so coldly twisted something deep in his gut. That evening when he returned to the penthouse, he found Evelyn curled up in the living room with a book, the warm glow from the lamp caught in her hair, and for a moment he just stood there watching, before walking over and saying they needed to talk. She marked her page carefully before looking up and asking about what he said about why they got married. Her brows lifted slightly, and she asked if he meant why he agreed, or why she agreed. He sat across from her and told her he knew about her family's debts, and how they had been drowning after the lawsuit, and how his family had paid them off. She set the book aside and told him then he knew everything. He said no because he didn't know how she felt about it. Her gaze was steady as she told him she had felt like an asset being traded. Like her life had suddenly been worth a dollar amount and a signature on a contract. She had told herself it was worth it to save her parents from losing everything. But deep down, she had hoped foolishly that maybe over time they could be more than a business deal. Alexander swallowed and started to say he told her from the start that it was an arrangement, but she finished for him saying yes, and she had believed him, but believing him hadn't stopped her from wanting more. It hadn't stopped her from looking at him some nights and wondering if he ever saw her at all. Her voice was calm, but each word hit like a blow as she told him when the first month passed. Without so much as a touch, she told herself it was fine. And when the first year ended, with them still living like polite strangers, she told herself she didn't care, but the truth was, she did care. She cared enough for it to hurt. He leaned forward and told her he had seen her in the shower that night. Her eyes flickered, but she said nothing, and he went on saying he hadn't meant to intrude, but seeing her cry had made him realize he had never known her, had never asked. She let the silence stretch before answering that he had never wanted to know, and now suddenly, because another man showed interest, he had decided to care. He flinched at the truth in her words, and told her it wasn't like that. She challenged him to tell her what it was, but no answer came. She rose, smoothing the folds of her dress, and told him he couldn't, because he didn't know, and until he did this arrangement, was all it would ever be. She walked away, leaving him alone in the lamplight. With her absence, heavier than her presence had ever been. The next morning began like any other, with the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the penthouse and the low hum of the city beyond the windows. Alexander entered the kitchen expecting to find Evelyn at the table with her notebook as she often was, but the space was empty, and on the counter lay an envelope with his name written in her neat handwriting. He opened it slowly, feeling his pulse quicken as he read the short note inside that said he had once told her this was an arrangement, and that today she was choosing to arrange her own life. Not to wait up, his jaw tightened as he checked his phone and saw a notification from the security system indicating that the front door had opened at 7:42 a.m. He called her, but the call went to voicemail, and an uneasy chill crept over him. Hours later, while he was in a meeting, his assistant appeared at the door with a hesitant expression and handed him a printed article from a business news site. The headline read, "Drake International CEO's wife to join Milan luxury project with Adrian Cross," and beneath it was a photo taken at the Whitmore Gala of Evelyn standing beside Adrian. Both mid-laugh. Alexander's vision narrowed, and he left the office without a word, the image burning in his mind. By the time he reached the penthouse, the late afternoon sun was slanting across the living room, and Evelyn was there gathering a few things into a leather tote. He asked if she was going to Milan, and his voice was low but sharp. She didn't look up as she said yes, because it was an opportunity she wouldn't get if she waited for his permission. He stepped closer, asking if she had even considered how it looked or how it affected him, and she met his gaze. With eyes cool as ice, telling him that for 2 years he had done whatever he pleased without considering how it affected her, so he should forgive her if she didn't shape her life around his image. Then she said she had found the contract, the one outlining how long they had to stay married to secure the European deal. 5 years minimum, no children required, no intimacy expected, just 2 signatures keeping up appearances. He went still. As she cut him off, saying that was before he decided to notice her, before he saw her crying in the shower and realized she was a person, and that he thought that erased 2 years of being invisible. He told her it wasn't like that, but his voice lacked conviction. She demanded to know what it was, but when no answer came, she shook her head and told him he couldn't say because he didn't know, and that was why she was leaving. She slung the tote over her shoulder and walked toward the door. He called her name, and his voice broke just slightly. She paused, but didn't turn as she told him he hadn't wanted her to stay either. Then, she opened the door and stepped out. The sound of it closing echoing through the penthouse like the final note of a song he hadn't realized was ending. For the rest of the night, Alexander paced the living room with the city lights blurring beyond the glass, thinking of calling her again but stopping himself, because she had made her choice. And yet for the first time in his life, he felt powerless, as if all the influence and money in the world couldn't buy back the one thing he was losing. By dawn, he knew what he had to do, and that it would cost him everything he had worked for, but if it brought her back, it would be worth it. He picked up the phone and called his father, telling him to cancel the European deal. His father thundered over the line, asking if he had any idea what he was throwing away, and Alexander said yes, and that he didn't care, because this wasn't about business anymore. He hung up before his father could respond, and the decision was solid in his mind. The next step would be harder. Finding Evelyn before she boarded a flight to Italy. Alexander did not waste time. By the time the city was fully awake, he was already in his car scanning the traffic ahead as his driver wove through the morning rush. His contacts had confirmed that Evelyn was at her parents' townhouse, a quiet brick building on a tree-lined street far removed from the steel and glass of his world. When he arrived, he told his driver to wait and climbed the steps alone. Her mother opened the door with surprise flickering across her face, before it shifted into something colder. He asked if Evelyn was there, and after a hesitation, she stepped aside, saying she was in the sunroom. Evelyn was seated on a cream love seat with sunlight spilling over her as she read, and she did not look up when he entered. He told her they needed to talk, and she replied that they already had. He said she hadn't heard him then, so she should hear him now, and told her he had cancelled the European deal. Her eyes lifted in disbelief as she asked what he had just said. He repeated it, and explained that the deal was the reason their marriage had existed in the first place, and that without it, there was no contract binding her to him. That she was free to leave if she wanted. She closed the book slowly, and asked why he would do that. He told her it was because he didn't want this to be an arrangement anymore. He wanted it to be a marriage, a real one. Her brow furrowed as suspicion warred with something softer, and she asked if he expected her to believe that one decision erased everything. He admitted it didn't erase it, but it was a start, and the only way he knew to prove he was choosing her over everything else. She looked away, her fingers tightening around the spine of the book, before saying this wasn't just about her. There was something else. He crossed the room and sat across from her, asking what it was, and she met his gaze with steady eyes as she told him she was pregnant. The words landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending shockwaves through the air. He searched her face for any sign. She was uncertain, but there was none, and she nodded once to confirm she had found out 2 weeks ago, and hadn't planned to tell him until she knew where they stood. A dozen thoughts collided in his mind: fear, protectiveness, and a fierce need to be part of whatever came next. He told her she should have told him sooner, and she asked why. So he could add it to the list of obligations he never wanted. He shook his head and told her it was so he could tell her he wanted to be there for all of it. For her, for the child, for them. She studied him, searching for the catch, and told him she didn't trust easily, and that he had given her every reason not to. He said he knew, and that was why he wasn't asking her to trust him right now, but to watch him and see if he meant what he said. The silence stretched between them, until finally she set the book aside and told him if she agreed to stay, it would not be because of grand gestures or cancelled deals, but because he showed her every day that she wasn't just decoration. His mouth curved slightly, and he said then he would start now before pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. He handed it to her, explaining it was the deed to her parents' house and the remaining shares of their company. All hers with no strings attached. Her breath caught as she told him he didn't have to, and he replied that he wanted to, because her family's security shouldn't be tied to him or his company, and that he wanted her to know she could walk away at any time, and he would still want her to stay. She looked from the envelope back to him, and said she didn't know what to say. He told her to say she would give him a chance. After a long pause, she whispered one chance. And though he kept his expression composed, relief washed through him. For the first time in 2 years they left together, walking side by side into the pale winter sunlight with the air between them, charged with something fragile but alive. The days that followed were nothing like the 2 years before, as Alexander began paying attention to the details he had ignored for so long. He learned that Evelyn preferred her coffee with just a splash of cream and no sugar, that she kept a small collection of vintage postcards in her desk drawer, and that she sometimes hummed under her breath when she worked on her sketches. He stopped scheduling early meetings so he could have breakfast with her, even if it was just toast and quiet conversation. At first, she kept her guard up, speaking to him in the same measured tones as before, but gradually, those edges began to soften. One rainy afternoon, he found her in the living room, with papers spread out around her as she worked on a new design concept. He brought her a mug of tea, and set it beside her without a word. She glanced up, and her eyes lingered on him for a moment. Before she said thank you, it was a small thing, but it felt like a step forward. He accompanied her to her first prenatal appointment, sitting beside her in the waiting room, and ignoring the curious glances of strangers. When the doctor placed the grainy ultrasound image in her hands, Alexander saw something flicker in her expression. Wonder, fear, and hope all tangled together. He reached for her hand, and for the first time she didn't pull away. He told her softly that it was their child, and she looked at him as if searching for any sign of pretense. Finding none, she simply nodded. At home he made space for her work, converting one of the unused rooms into a design studio. She stood in the doorway the day it was finished, with her fingers brushing the edge of the drafting table, asking if he did this for her, and he corrected her, saying, "For us." The turning point came one evening when they were cooking together. Something neither of them had done before. He was clumsy with the knife, and she laughed. A real unguarded laugh that lit up the room. She teased that he was hopeless, and he told her to teach him. She moved behind him, guiding his hands with her breath warm against his ear, and neither of them stepped away. Over the weeks, he made a habit of leaving small notes, for her, sometimes a reminder to eat, sometimes a line from a poem, sometimes simply, "I see you," and she kept them in a drawer, though he pretended not to notice. When she received another call from Adrian, offering again to bring her on board for the Milan project, she surprised herself by declining, telling him her life was here now, and that she had other plans. Alexander never asked what she said, but he saw the missed call on her phone and the quiet smile on her face that night. As winter melted into early spring, they began talking about the future. Real conversations, instead of the contractual logistics that had once defined them. Evelyn spoke of starting her own design firm, specializing in spaces that told a story, and Alexander offered to invest, but she told him she wanted to do it on her own. He replied that he would be her first client. One Sunday morning they visited the old Carter Foundation building, which had fallen into disuse. Sunlight streamed through dust-coated windows as Evelyn walked through the halls describing her vision for a community arts center, and Alexander listened, not as a businessman calculating returns, but as a husband proud of the woman beside him. He said simply, "Let's do it together," and in that moment, she realized he meant every word he had been saying for weeks. Though the walls she had built were still there, a door had finally opened. 6 months later, the spring air in New York carried the faint scent of cherry blossoms drifting from the park below their building as Evelyn stood before a mirror, adjusting the simple ivory dress she had chosen herself. It was not a designer gown meant for the society pages, but soft, flowing, and hers. Behind her, Alexander appeared in the reflection, wearing a suit that was sharp, yet understated. He asked if she was ready, and she met his gaze in the mirror, and nodded. This wedding was nothing like the first, with no photographers, no business associates, and no staged smiles. Just a small gathering of family and close friends in the garden of the newly restored Carter Foundation building. They exchanged vows. Under an archway covered in pale roses, their words, quiet, but certain. Alexander said, "I choose you every day for as long as you'll let me," and Evelyn replied that she would let him, as long as he remembered she was not there to be seen, but to be loved. When they kissed this time it was slow and deliberate, the seal on a promise made without contracts or conditions. A year later, the building had been transformed into a vibrant community arts center, where children's laughter echoed through the halls as Evelyn walked between easels, greeting young artists and their families, while upstairs, Alexander reviewed proposals for expanding the center's programs. He had kept his word and was her partner in every way. Their home life was different too, as the once silent penthouse was now filled with warmth and conversation over breakfast and the quiet joy of two people who no longer measured each other's worth by utility. On a late summer afternoon, Evelyn returned home to find Alexander in the nursery, rocking their infant daughter. The sight stopped her in the doorway as he spoke softly to the baby, telling her about the city lights and the places they would see together one day. When he looked up and saw Evelyn, a smile spread across his face, one that reached his eyes completely. He whispered that the baby was almost asleep, and Evelyn stepped into the room, leaning against his shoulder as they both looked down at the tiny bundle. In that moment, she thought of the woman she had been 2 years ago, the one who had agreed to a marriage out of duty and lived as a shadow in her own life. That woman was gone, and in her place stood someone who had been seen, valued, and loved for exactly who she was. Alexander pressed a kiss to her hair and murmured, "Never just decoration, always my heart." The words sank deep, not as a dramatic declaration, but as a truth proven over time, and as the city stretched out beyond their windows. Evelyn knew that home was not the penthouse or the garden or the restored foundation building. Home was here, in the choice they made every day to stand side by side, and she understood that love does not always arrive with fireworks or grand beginnings. Sometimes it comes quietly after mistakes and distance, and it stays because two people decide to see each other and keep choosing each other, no matter how the world wants to find them.